All right, welcome to Poho's Bullpen. I'm your host, Seth Poho, talking about baseball and sometimes a little bit more for my first episode. I have with me Jonathan Daniel, author of the new book, Phinally, The Phillies, the Royals, and the 1980 baseball season that almost wasn't, a new book by McFarland Books. Glad to have with me Jonathan Daniel. How's it going since the book dropped?
It's been going well. I've actually had some really nice responses so far, and thanks for having me, Seth. I appreciate it, first of all. And yeah, it's been going well. I've had some nice comments so far, and I've had a lot of people um, that have said they're excited to read it, which is kind of nice that you spend that much time working on something and people are actually excited to read it, as opposed to just yeah, whatever. That sounds nice. So that's kind of good.
Well, I know before the book got released, I mean I was following you on Twitter and you're always a fun person to follow, especially since for a baseball history aficionado like myself, I was like, all right, 1980, it was before I was born by a couple of years, but it's like you always heard about the stories and of course the two teams involved in that World Series, the Phillies and the Royals. I was like, oh, it's this like epic matchup between these two teams that just always just could never, get to the finish line. But you went above and beyond. I mean, this entire book really spans through spring training of 1980, and not just those teams, but the entire major leagues, and really goes all the way through towards the end. So, kind of going with the first idea of the first question is, what really was your big motivation to take on the 1980 MLB season?
Well, I think one of the, actually, first of all, I'm a huge 1980s guy in general. I was born in 1967, so I was 12 when the Phillies won that World Series. But I spent the entirety, for the most part, of my high school and college life in the entire decade of the 80s, and I think there's something to that. I think in terms of my 80s, being the 80s aficionado that I am, I think had I been 5 years born 5 years earlier, 5 years later, I think you split that between the 70s and the 80s, or the 80s and 90s, and it kind of becomes one or the other. But for me, formative years, so to speak, came from the 80s. And so I initially wanted to write a book actually about the entire decade, similar to Dan Epstein's Big Hair and Plastic Grass, which is another fantastic read. And so I started to look into sort of one-off events. Freddie Patek hit 3 home runs in a game, and Willie McCovey retired in the middle of the season, and all these little one-off events, and started writing about those. And then I realized I was 50 or 60 pages in at that point and hadn't even begun to tell the story of what actually took place in the 1980 season in terms of who won the divisions and all that kind of stuff. And so I quickly realized, well, I could either continue down this path and write a 1,500 page book on the entire decade, or just narrow my focus to 1980. And the decision was considerably easier for me because I grew up a big Phillies fan, and that 1980 Phillies team is a special one for me. So that made it a lot easier. And so but I still wanted to talk about. I didn't want this to be a Phillies book. I wanted it to be a book about the entire season, so that people who were not Phillies fans could still get something out of it. Which from a baseball standpoint, I think that's fun, and then also just certainly from a marketing standpoint, makes it easier to sell. That I'm not going to sell a book about the Phillies in San Francisco or somewhere else.
And it's true. I mean, and you did, I think, a great job in terms of really giving everybody their fair share in that book. I mean, especially as you mentioned about what Dan Epstein did with Plastic Grass. I mean, it was definitely right on cue there. And I feel like as if, knowing you, having followed you for so long, it's a nice little excuse for you to also write about Mike Schmidt in good detail.
Yeah, Schmidt's my guy, and so that was really the year that he kind of put it all together. I mean, he was obviously a very, very good player entering that season, but I think that was the year that he really sort of kind of took that next step, maybe from star to superstar. Won his first MVP award that year, hit 48 home runs, so he set the record for home runs by a third baseman. Won his first MVP award that year, and I think really importantly for him too, was he also kind of got the monkey off of his back in the postseason as well. He didn't have a great NLCS. He only hit 280 in the NLCS, but he hit 381 in the World Series, hit 2 homers, drove in 7, and was the MVP of the World Series. And I think that was really, really big for him, and for the city of Philadelphia. I mean, one of the things I said at the very beginning of the book was, that people either loved him or hated him in Philadelphia, but very few people didn't have an opinion.
And that's amazing when you really think about that, because for someone like me, I mean, I'm more of the '90s kind of baseball fan, the '90s kid who grew up with that. From hearing from my older brothers who were more or less those kids who were born in the '70s, who got into baseball as kids, there was always this reverence for Mike Schmidt, maybe slight Ohio bias because of my family being from Ohio. But there's always this idea that it felt like as if everybody loved Schmitty. But, as you pointed out throughout the book, and as he even made note throughout his entire career, he knew he had a tenuous relationship with the fans and particularly with the media at time. And especially in a city like Philadelphia, where those fans, I mean, they will just get on you if they feel like as if you weren't putting in your best effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was, I mean, there were certain moments. There was a big moment in the NLCS against the Astros where he struck out in a key situation, and the game was, I think it was game 4, and the game was in Houston. And I just remember when going back and watching that game on YouTube, and I'm thinking to myself, obviously he's upset that he doesn't deliver in that situation, but I'm also thinking to myself, man, he was lucky that game was in Houston, because he would have been absolutely buried by the fans in Philadelphia. Because I mean, at that point, again, here's a team that they had won the division in '76, '77, and '78, and they'd won a total of 2 postseason games in those 3 series. And Schmidt, he hit 308 in '76 in the NLCS, but he went 1 for 16 in '77 and 3 for 15 in '78. So he had struggled in the postseason, and for him to finally, as I said earlier, kind of put it together in the World Series, was huge for him, and I think huge for the city too.
And it's right. I mean, especially when you're talking about that game 4. I remember watching a lot of those games again on YouTube. Game 5, when he had an opportunity that it looked like as if he was going to have a big spot late in the game before Gary Maddox hit that double that eventually won the pennant for the Phillies. You can just tell, I feel like, as if in a lot of at-bats for Schmidt, his body language was, all right, I got to be the hero this time. I got to be the one to make that big play. And then you see him, chase a breaking ball out of the zone that's probably off by like 2 feet. And you're going, oh, Mike, you got to tighten up on that spot.
Yeah. And the crazy thing too, I mean, again, one of the things that really struck me when you go back and watch those games on YouTube, like you said, is how far away from the plate a lot of those guys stood. Schmidt was in the back right-hand corner of the box, and then he had that hip wiggle that me and thousands of other people imitated back in the day. But I mean, boy, it's one of those small things that just shows how much the game has changed. You compare that to a guy like Rizzo in Chicago, who just stands right on top of the plate, and Schmidt was so far away that, I mean, it looked like he couldn't get to anything outside, but if you pitched to him out there, he could go get it if he needed to.
It's funny that you bring up about, especially about guys like Rizzo and like that. It's just so much of that dynamic that it doesn't feel like 1980 was that far away in terms of the way that the game was played, but it was in a weird way. I mean, you talk about Schmidt's approach to hitting now. I mean, you look at, changing the topic a little bit, you look at back then, and one of the things that I thought was most interesting about that season was that you had a team in the Oakland A's who had their entire starting pitching staff. They all had 10 complete games, at least 10 complete games that season. And I believe, what was it? I believe they set the record for most complete games by a team in the history of baseball, I believe, that year.
Yeah, they threw 94 CGs that year, which is just insane. I mean, and Brian Kingman was the 5th starter. He went 8-20, and he had 10 complete games. And Rick Langford was the ace of the staff. He threw 28 complete games, including 22 in a row.
Unbelievable.
Mike Norris threw 24. Matt Keogh had 20. Steve McCatty had 11. And each of those 4 guys, Langford, Norris, Keogh, and McCatty, each threw 14 inning complete games in that season. And to me, one of the most amazing stats out of all of that is that the guy who led the team in saves, Bob Lacey, who led the team with 6, by the way, he threw a complete game on the last weekend of the season. So your closer throws a CG, on the day before the season. It was the Saturday before, that the season ended on Sunday. So, and one of the
Right.
things I read was that, there were a couple games where the A's were, I don't know, they certainly weren't in the hunt, but they were maybe within striking distance. And then the bullpen blew some leads, and Billy Martin kind of just said, you know what, that's it. I'm just going to go with my starters. And so, Langford threw 22 in a row. And when Martin pulled him to break that streak, there were two outs in the ninth inning. It was, I think, a 1 or 2 run game, and there was two guys on, and so, I mean, in a sense, it's obviously not nearly as impressive a scale, but it's sort of like DiMaggio, where he had the 56 game hitting streak, and then he gets snapped, and then he started, what was it, a 16 game streak or something like that?
Yeah.
After that. So, I mean, and Langford was kind of that similar thing with bookends around. I think he threw 2 or 3 more after his streak was snapped. So, I mean, and again, you look at Langford threw 28 CGs in 1 year. The current active leaders are Bartolo Colon and CC Sabathia, and they each have 38.
Well, it's funny because, I mean, because I looked it up. I was like, all right, how many did the entire league have this past season? Again, you mentioned 94 complete games by Oakland alone in 1980. In 2018, the entire league, 42 complete games in 2018.
Yeah. I mean, it's, and I don't want to get into the whole, get off my lawn kind of a
Right.
thing. But I mean, that's one of those things that's it's just indicative of how much the game has changed, good or bad. That's another discussion, but it is amazing that shows how much the game has changed. And that's one of the ways.
And it's true because, like, it really shows you how far. I mean, also, let's take into consideration the type of athletes that were in Major League Baseball. I mean, watching one of those old Phillies yearbook videos from 1980, the big thing that everyone was talking about was the fact that because Steve Carlton in his spare time was studying martial arts, he was essentially exempt from all other basic calisthenics any
Right.
other Phillies pitcher had to do. And that was only because he just ran a lot, which nowadays you probably get a lot of pitching coaches who would argue against not having their pitchers run a ton during spring training, let alone in between starts, compared to now where it's like, guys are in much better condition shape because we know so much more. And, now you have guys who throw significantly faster with better movement than they had in 1980.
Yeah. But I think to that point, you also, and this is something, the discussion I've had with a number of other people too. I mean, in 1980, basically the three big flamethrower guys were Nolan Ryan, J.R. Richard, and Goose Gossage, right? And there's some other guys who threw super hard too. But the thing was, I mean, I don't think that guys today throw significantly harder, with the exception maybe of Aroldis Chapman or a couple of other guys. But those guys today don't necessarily throw harder than Ryan or Goose or J.R. Richard did, but they don't work there. Whereas guys today, or max effort guys, starters, we talked about with CGs, right? I mean,
Right.
they go out and they go max effort. Noah Syndergaard tries to throw every pitch 110 miles an hour. And that's one of the reasons why guys can't throw CGs. But I mean, Ryan could throw high 90s, but he worked in the low 90s. And when he needed to dial it up, he did. And again, I'm not saying that makes those guys in that era better pitchers than now. I mean, again, to your point, they're much, much better athletes now. I don't think there's any way that you can argue that point. But I think it's just how the game has changed.
And getting back to, and I feel like I've kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent there on the pitcher thing, but getting back to your book and getting back towards the real meat and potatoes of it, talking towards the back end about the Phillies, talking about pressure. Going into that 1980 season, this is going to be the second year for Dallas Green, if I stand corrected, right?
His first full season. He didn't take the job till September of '79.
Okay, I was going to say.
Yeah.
And it felt like as if it was definitely the shot in the arm that team needed, because nothing against Danny Ozark, who, I mean, again, he was there for those teams in the 70s that won those divisions for the Phillies, but it felt like as if Dallas was the ideal guy in terms of his personality and how he was going to deal with that team. That was the reason they were able to go all the way that year.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think he was the ideal guy for the organization. He was not the ideal guy for the players. And a lot of it was interesting because I mean, he was the former farm director, so he knew a lot of the younger players, and a lot of the younger players certainly knew him and maybe liked him, but the older guys did not at all. And one of the reasons the older guys didn't like them is because he challenged them and came in and said, "Look, I mean, this is the way it's going to be. You guys are too good to fall flat in the postseason every year." I mean, one of the things I talked about in the book was he came out with, signs that said "We, not I" in spring training, and there were a lot that was met with a lot of snickers and jokes and that kind of stuff about, Larry Boa said, "Well, when do the pom pom girls arrive?" But I mean, it was something where they said, I mean, where basically Dallas Green looked and said, there's a bunch of individuals on this team that as long as they get their 2 hits a night, they really don't care whether or not we win or lose. And again, that was an incredibly talented team. I mean, at the time, Pete Rose's issues notwithstanding, you've got 3 lock Hall of Famers on that team.
Right.
You've got a Gold Glove center fielder, a Gold Glove shortstop, a very, very good defensive second baseman in Manny Trio. And then you've got Lazinski, who had a bad year in 79, had a bad and didn't have a good year in 1980 either, but was one of, I mean, he and Schmidt were an absolute dominant force in the middle 70s. I mean, the biggest issue they had was the pitching rotation. But when you have Steve Carlton at the front of that rotation, you could do a heck of a lot worse. I mean, and Lefty was phenomenal that year. He's the last guy to throw 300 innings in a season.
Truly remarkable. And, you talk about Rose, and that was another guy that you talk about the "we, not I" kind of mantra that Green really wanted that team to adopt. It felt like as if you had no better person to really help kind of drive that. And I felt really took a lot off of Mike Schmidt was having Pete Rose on that ball club to kind of help, reinforce Green's idea, even if necessarily the players didn't want to buy into it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing, it's that thing, Pete, Dallas Green can yell at those guys all he wants, but if Pete says exactly the same thing, then it's like, well, this guy's been an MVP and he's won 2 World Series, and and coming from a peer on top of that, it means a lot more. There was one episode where Green really dressed the team down, and the reporters went in and were talking to some of the players, and a lot of them were grumbling, and Pete basically said, "Yeah, I see his point." And so, and then the other thing, Pete was, to your, sort of to your point, Pete, in addition to taking a lot of pressure off of Mike Schmidt, Schmidt will gives a lot of credit to Pete of basically Pete arrived and showed Mike Schmidt how good Mike Schmidt was. Schmidt spent a lot of time in his head and, had a lot of self-doubt, and Pete came in and just told him, "Look, you're as good as any player in the big leagues, and you need to start acting like it," basically. And Schmidt took a lot of that to heart. And again, I think that's certainly one of those intangibles. I mean, I think it's goes without saying that if the Phillies don't sign Pete Rose at the end of the 1978 season, they don't win the World Series in 1980. And there's all the on the field stuff, but then there's that factor of him pushing Schmidt to be that much of a better player that can't be overlooked either.
And it's amazing, too, because you just look at Schmidt's numbers really from 1980 on into the end of his career in 89. I mean, obviously age, took its toll by like 85, but, 80, he had a great year, MVP, Gold Glove, Silver Slugger, of course, obviously the World Series MVP. 81, it's like, all right, I'm going to do just as good again.
Yeah.
And just kept putting up those great numbers that he already had. And it wasn't like as if he was a slouch in the 70s either. I mean, as much as everyone today talks about Nolan Arenado as that, is that Mike Schmidt kind of guy, Schmidt kind of came into that league with already the idea that his identity was his bat. And
Yeah,
then he just
absolutely.
showed it more often.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, he was a phenomenal hitter, and he was, I genuinely think, I mean, obviously he was a power hitter, but I genuinely think that he is a guy who, had he chosen to, could have been a guy that hit 330 every year with fewer home runs if he wanted to. I mean, he was a real student of hitting. and just took it seriously. And again, sometimes to his detriment, in terms of getting in his own head and maybe going through some prolonged slumps. But I think he was that good of a hitter. He was certainly not an all or nothing guy. And he also, I heard an interview with him recently where he changed his swing relatively, about halfway through his career and really kind of cut things down and started to hit for a higher average because he didn't want to be a guy that hit 40 home runs or 30 home runs, but hit 230 or 240. He didn't want to be, he didn't want to be Rob Deere, right? Or,
Right.
one of those guys. I mean, he wanted to be a complete hitter, and that was important to him. And, and it showed.
And he really did come up big, especially in those last couple of series, especially with the way that the Phillies regular season culminated with those big wins against Montreal. Which, I mean, you think about a team that to win crucial games in the stretch. It was a good team like the Montreal Expos at that time. That was a nice little momentum builder going into that NLCS.
Yeah, I mean that series, the Phillies ended the season in Montreal. It's a 3-game set on the last weekend of the year. The two teams are tied going into the series, and Montreal had taken it to the Phillies the previous weekend. And so the Phillies won game 1 of the series on Friday, and then game 2, it was a cold, crappy, rainy day in Montreal. The game was delayed by 3 hours almost, I think, because of rain. I think it was 3 hours. So the game gets started really late, and then it goes extra innings. Phillies were a very, very good fielding team, as we talked about earlier, but
Right.
they made 5 errors in that game. And so the game goes extra innings, and Schmidt ends up hitting a home run off of Stan Bonson in the 11th inning, which becomes one of the most famous radio calls in Philadelphia history. And the other thing that's really interesting about that is that the couple things about that particular at bat. I mean, Dick Williams is the Expos manager, and I'm no way am I saying that I'm qualified to second guess Dick Williams. However, I'm going to second guess Dick Williams. Because what was interesting was that when Schmidt's up in that particular instance, Don McCormick was on deck. Mac was I was the official scorer for the Clearwater Phillies back in the mid 90s, and McCormick was actually the manager for the Clearwater Phillies. But McCormick was in his second game of his big league career. He was a catcher. He had 0 at bats. And the Phillies were out of catchers at that point.
Right.
Orland started the game, and then Boone came in and pinch hit. And so McCormick was the catcher, and Williams chooses to pitch to Schmidt rather than walking him to pitch to McCormick. And Schmidt hits a 2-run homer, and they win the series and the division.
And I can imagine all the Phillies fans just remembering the iconic Harry Kalas call.
Yeah, it was Andy Musser.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was Andy Musser who had the call, and yeah, he buried it. It's a classic Philly call, so it's one of the big ones from that season certainly, and I think, as we said before, kind of all time in Philadelphia.
All right, and channeling 12-year-old Seth, you're going back there to 1980. Phillies clinched a division. They're going up against, by far, the best pitching staff in the National League in the Houston Astros. I mean, that was loaded. And that's even considering the fact that, they didn't have J.R. Richards anymore after he had his stroke in August following the All-Star break. How much confidence did you have in the Phillies at that point going into that NLCS against that team?
I had a lot of confidence at that point because I didn't know any better. I mean, looking back on it now, I mean, I will maintain till the day I die that if J.R. Richards stays healthy, the Astros win the World Series in 1980. I mean, he was an absolutely dominant pitcher. He was having his best season. And again, when you look at if he stays healthy, now you have a 5-game NLCS where you're going to face Nolan Ryan and J.R. Richard with Joe Niekro sandwiched in between them. So you've got 2 of the hardest throwers in the league with a knuckleballer in between them. And so those 3 guys are probably going to, I mean, and then you've also got Ken Forsch, who was a really, really good pitcher too. So he probably starts game 4, and then you come back with Ryan or Richard, or probably Richard in game 5, but then you come back with Richard in game 5 and you've got Necro maybe to come off the bench. I mean, would you want to face those two guys back to back in the same game? I
Well,
mean,
especially since Houston had the advantage for those last games that were being played
in
played
Houston.
in Houston, a
Yeah.
huge pitcher's park back then. I mean, it's
Yeah.
tailor made for them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was a phenomenal LCS. I mean, 4 of the 5 games went extra innings. One of them, I think, was game 2 or game 3, was a 1-0 final in 11 or 12 innings. It was just a phenomenal series. And then again, the Astros have a 4-run lead in the 7th inning with Nolan Ryan on the hill in game 5, and you think it's over. And then the Phillies came back and tied it and sent it to extra innings. And like you said before, Maddox, wins the game for him.
Yeah, actually, it was the game 3 was the 1-0 one. That was the one where Denny Walling had the sac fly in the 11th.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
But and it's amazing too, because honestly, I can understand the confidence looking at the Phillies lineup in comparison to Houston. I mean, that was a much more veteran team. It felt like as if a lot of their strength really came from their outfield trio of Cedeno, Cruz, and Poole, especially defensively. I mean, Poole was putting up insane numbers. It's amazing how it was like the first game was really the only boring one, I guess you can say, because that was a little tough on the Astros having to travel all the way to Philadelphia when they had played that 1-game playoff against LA the day before.
Yeah, that's certainly rough. I mean, and again, well, we didn't, I guess, get into this, but I mean, the Dodgers. So we talked about the Phillies and the Expos, right? Well, the Dodgers and Astros had a 3-game series to end the regular season, and the Astros had a 3-game lead going into that series in LA, and the Dodgers swept them. So that forced that 1-game playoff. So I mean, again, I talked before about if Richard's healthy. Well, if Richard's healthy, then the Astros probably wrap that division up earlier, which allows them to set up their rotation for the postseason. But when you have a 1-game playoff to even get into the postseason, then it's next man up, and whoever can go can go. And again, they had their pitching staff was playing deep, so it wasn't like they had to run a nobody out there. But it did kind of jack their rotation up a little bit. And again, and like you said, you win a 1-game playoff, and then you have to fly from Los Angeles to Philadelphia to play the next day. That's pretty rough.
Yeah, I can imagine. But, obviously the Phillies took care of it there in game 5, and then they end up facing off against Kansas City. And much like the Phillies, I mean, Kansas City was in that space where, I mean, they were a younger franchise. They hadn't existed for as long as the Phillies were, but 76, 77, 78, win the AL West. They go out and play the Yankees, lose every single time, especially for them, much like the Phillies. There's always those heartbreaker kind of plays. Finally, 1980, they end up sweeping the Yankees in that ALCS, which I feel like as if the games were really insignificant, except for that, it was game 2, I believe, where Randolph got thrown out by that great throw by Brett. And then Steinbrenner wanted Mike Ferraro, the third base coach, fired immediately. And that ended up costing Dick Hauser his job.
Yeah, well, it's always a good move to fire a coach in the middle of a playoff series.
It always proves to be.
Exactly. So, I mean, that was kind of an anticlimactic series. I mean, again, taking the other big moment from that series, of course, is Brett hits the monumental blast off of Goose in game 3, and then took his sweet time to get around the bases. I think he took about 30 seconds to get around the bases, which was pretty interesting. But yeah, I mean, there were a lot of parallels between the Phillies and the Royals that season. They both were essentially had first-year managers. Jim Fry had taken over the Royals that season, and Dallas Green was essentially a first-year manager. They were both AstroTurf teams. It was the first ever all AstroTurf World Series. You brought up the fact that each of them had won their divisions in 76, 77, and 78, couldn't get past, various teams in the postseason to get to the World Series. And so for both of those teams to finally get there was a big deal for both organizations. And it turned out, I mean, it was an interesting series. The Phillies won the first 2 games, and then Kansas City comes back and wins the next 2, and so all of a sudden you're 2-2 with Game 5 in Kansas City, and it was a fun series.
It was. I mean, especially given, the fact that there were many memorable performances, both good and bad. I mean, I know in my mind, watching some of those games, it always felt like as if the Royals were just, it felt like as if they just couldn't get everything together. I mean, they had a great performances from Willie Aikens, who had those 2 home runs on his birthday, which, of course, baseball fans would later learn that he was pretty much partying nonstop that entire
Yeah.
World Series, an earlier indicator to how bad cocaine was.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
He,
then, go
no,
ahead.
go ahead.
But
He was I mean, Akins was an interesting guy too, because I mean, he had that great series. He hit 2 home runs in game 1. He hit 2 more in game 4. But he also, he had blown out his knee, and not blown it out, but he had injured his knee, and had to have surgery in '79. And so he came over in a trade from the Angels in 1980, and was a guy who put a lot of pressure on himself. And there was a moment early in the season where he was up with Hal McRae, and they ended up walking McRae to pitch to Akins. The Tigers did, and Akins beat them. And they asked Sparky Anderson about it after the game, and Sparky said, "I'd walk Hal McRae 1,000 times to pitch to Willie Aikens." And that Sparky being Sparky, and he had Hal McRae, in Cincinnati, but Aikens really took that to heart, and that was sort of wounded his pride a little bit, and so he put a lot of pressure on himself. This was really early in the season, put a lot of pressure on himself in that year, and then when Brett got hurt, Brett actually hurt his ankle, missed a month. And that's where Akins kind of really took it upon himself to kind of help carry the Royals through that period until Brett came back.
And Brett really had a pretty good postseason. I mean, you talk about the home run he had, but he's trying to. I mean, he hit above 300 in a World Series, despite the fact that he wasn't exactly 100% healthy in
No,
a certain way.
no, no, he wasn't. It's not often that you hear, press reports from a proctologist during a World Series. So yeah, I mean, he ended up getting pulled from game 2 because he had severe case of hemorrhoids, and fortunately, there was a day off in between game 2 and game 3, and so he had hemorrhoid surgery in between game 2 and game 3. And then, of course, since he's George Brett, he came back and homered in his first at bat in game 3, after having hemorrhoid surgery, which is, I mean, there are a lot of things that indicate how good of a season he had in 1980, but I mean, that's certainly one of them. There's not a lot of people that, have hemorrhoid surgery and come back and homer in their first at bat back the next day.
That's typical. That's typical Brett. I mean, especially for him. I mean, you talk about missing that month. He still won the batting title, won the MVP, and I mean, he was one of those key cogs in that Royals team. But another guy who had a great season for them and really was, I think, an understated player at that moment, but had a terrible World Series, was Willie Wilson, their center fielder. I mean, he put up an insane numbers during the regular season, and unfortunately, I mean, he had an atrocious World Series where it felt like as if he was guessing on every single at bat, and he ended up setting the World Series record for most strikeouts in a series.
Yeah, I mean, the all you need to know about how well Willie Wilson played in the regular season is that George Brett hit 390 and didn't lead his own team in hits. Willie Wilson had 220 hits. And people can, I've brought that up sometimes on Twitter, and people say, well, he didn't walk enough, well, okay. But if the guy, the reason that you want to walk is so that you can get on base.
Well, first off, they were never going to walk enough because their hitting coach was Charlie Lau.
Well,
most of those guys were listening to Charlie Lau. Lau wasn't about taking walks, and that's why Brett never had high walk totals.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, I think Willie was. I mean, he had a phenomenal year. I mean, he. Like I said, had 220 hits, and I don't have the numbers in front of me. Stole a whole bunch of bases, and was just a catalyst. I mean, that was a really, really good Royals team. I mean, that was a tremendous offensive team. They had a lot of speed at the top of the order. They had power all throughout. They were a really, really good team, and they had a good pitching staff too. They just kind of fell short at the end of the year, and fortunately for them, they won one a couple of years later. That was a really good team. I mean, and that kind of makes me think about the fact that I think the Astros still would have won that had Richard been healthy, because with as banged up as the Phillies were at the time, and the Phillies had some bad luck, but they also had some good luck. And I think if you have a healthy Astros pitching staff, I mean, I guess the big question is, could Kansas City's pitching shut down Houston's hitting? Because the Astros hit 49 home runs as a team in 1979, and didn't have a whole. I think if they hit maybe 60 or 70 in 1980, so there certainly isn't a whole lot of power there. So they had to manufacture runs, and so maybe the Royals shut the Astros down. But boy, that was a really good team, and I think that that's kind of one of the better teams to lose a World Series, I think, in recent memory.
And to clarify on Wilson's numbers, because I wrote some of them down just in case, he hit 326 that year, which, I mean, again, it's a pretty damn good average. I think he was one of the tops in the league for triples. He had 15 triples, 133 runs scored, 79 stolen bases. Obviously, he didn't lead in that because I imagine Henderson had 100 or something that year. But you're definitely right, though, that was a pretty darn good team. And I definitely would agree that the only Achilles heel for the Astros, if they would have made it to the World Series, would have been whether or not, what kind of offensive production they would have got. Because I think if I remember right, they were going through catchers left and right in that NLCS because Pete Rose kept beating them up.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that actually Louis Pujols was the catcher in that one game, and he took a foul tip. I think it was a foul tip, or he got hurt, so they take him out of the game and put in Bochy, and then like 2 innings later, Pete trucks Bochy. So, poor Bruce Bochy comes into the game as a defensive replacement and gets a forearm shiver to the face and becomes one of the sort of defining moments of Pete Rose's career. So, and Pete had actually 2 of them that year. There was that, and then of course there's the bobble catch in Game 6 of the World Series. The ball pops out of Booney's glove and off of Frank White's bat, and Pete is there to snare it. So that was another great moment from Pete in that year.
I always love that. I always love seeing that highlight because it's like you think, all right, Boone's got this one. I mean, knowing how great of a defensive player Boone was, but you see Pete, like when they show that like replay, Pete's just charging the whole way, going, all right, just in case Boone screws us up, I got him just in case.
Absolutely, yeah. It really and again, I think the amazing part about that is the fact that Pete catches that ball, and then the first thing he does is turns around and just starts bouncing it off the turf, blowing a bubble, walking back to let's go. Got one more out to get. That was the second out of the 9th inning. But Pete wasn't finished yet, so there was still more work to be done.
I'm trying to remember, was Wilson the last out? Because he struck out.
Yeah,
because it was
Hunter struck out Willie Wilson to end it.
And I imagine 12-year-old you was so thrilled, praying to your Larry Boa poster
exactly.
for the last 2 weeks.
Exactly. Yes. I actually was sitting on the end of my bed. I had one of those plastic batting helmets on that you used to get at the ballpark, and it was good to go.
Still, is that still one of your favorite moments of all time as a baseball fan?
Yeah. It has. Yeah, absolutely. I think when you're in that age, that whatever, maybe 8 to 14 or something like that, when you're kind of old enough to know what's going on, but not old enough to maybe be jaded. When a team that you root for wins it, the first team that you root for that wins a championship, I think that team is just always going to be special to you. Even if there are teams that come along later on that are better, that first one again, we're 38 years later, and granted, I just finished writing a book about it, but I've always been able to name, I could almost off the top of my head name all 20 or most of the guys on that roster that came through at some point in the season.
It's just an amazing ride when you get down to it, and especially with your love for the 1980s. I feel like as if going away from the book, because I brought it up to you earlier this week. Obviously, the Hall of Fame had their today's game committee meet, and of all the guys on the ballot, and again, this is not to attack this player, but it's amazing that Harold Baines, along with Lee Smith, got elected into the Hall of Fame. At least Smith hit the 50% threshold with the Baseball Writers of America. And this, I'm not saying this to necessarily dunk on Baines, but it felt like as if Baines' career was so much more about the player he could have been when he got drafted by the White Sox than, unfortunately, what the numbers and what his actual performance in the long run really was.
Yeah, I mean, I look. I mean, I posted on Twitter before that I'm not a Hall of Fame purist. I'm thrilled for Harold Baines. I think, if Baines doesn't have some of the work stoppages, I think there's a pretty good chance he gets 3,000 hits. He was really close. But I mean, so there's an argument to be made there. The flip side of that argument is, that he never had 200 hits and he never, won an MVP and he spent most of his career as a DH and all those other things. I mean, but I think that the thing that really stinks the most about it is that this is a guy who, has just had the most important thing professionally that could happen to him, and all he's hearing is how he doesn't deserve it. And I
And I
and I think that sucks.
and I agree with you. I mean, his final career hit total was 2,800 and I think it was 66. So I mean, Jerry Riesdorf, I believe, said if it wasn't for those work stoppages, he would have gotten it. And I know him and Tony La Russa were emphatic on trying to get him in. But it's kind of an amazing story, though, when you think about Baines. Here was a guy who was brought to the attention of the White Sox scouting staff um, by Bill Veeck, of all people. Veeck was living in Maryland at the time, and the same high school his kids went to, Baines was a superstar player. He called up the White Sox saying, "Hey, you got to take a look at this kid." And it didn't take long before the White Sox said, "You know what? Veeck may be on to something. This kid's got some pretty good potential." And going back to the 1980s, I mean, again, I'm a 90s kid. So the Harold Baines I saw was, the kind of guy who was worn down with injuries that kind of, nagged him off and on, that made him into a DH and not a right fielder anymore. So I never really got to see the win ugly Sox kind of Harold Baines. I mean, what was that Harold Baines like?
Well, I mean, Harold Baines wasn't the kind of guy, like we said, that got 200 hits a year, but he was the guy that got 178 hits every year. And again, does that make you a Hall of Famer? Maybe not, probably not, to be honest with you. But he was an absolutely, I mean, I don't want to say dominant hitter. He was a very, very good hitter. And again, we're getting into this whole Hall of Fame versus Hall of Very Good thing.
Right.
And one of the things that amazes me is how many people seem to be genuinely offended about, so they've been anointed the keeper of the sanctity of the Hall of Fame because they're on Twitter or something. And I just think, you can get as upset as you want about it, but the bottom line is he's not going to get unelected. He is a Hall of Famer now. And I mean, Baines was a really, really good hitter. I mean, he really was. And he had a great stroke and, I mean, he wasn't a dominant player, but he was a very, very good player. And again, does that make you a Hall of Famer? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, probably not, to be honest with you. I'm thrilled for Harold Baines that he got in. I'm not going to champion his cause, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because he's in, and and they're not going to pull it from him. So, congratulations, Harold Baines. I mean, and again, I think it really stinks that this guy hits the pinnacle of his professional career, and all he hears is that he doesn't deserve it.
And and again, he definitely deserves some sort of recognition. And looking at the flip side of the other guy voted in, Lee Smith, who, for the longest time, before there was Hoffman, before there was Rivera, this was the guy who had the career lead in saves. And I know obviously it's hard to necessarily look at just those stats from the modern baseball fans because you want to look at the advanced analytics. But there was definitely something special about a player like Lee Smith, talking about his, really good fastball. I always remember the fact that he had that fork ball that he uses to change. Looking at his rise with the Cubs in the 1980s, I mean, what do you really remember from a guy like Lee Smith?
He was a dominant guy. I mean, and again, he was a guy who threw hard. He was a big guy, and when he came into the game, for the most part, it was game over. I mean, he was a guy that was a top-notch dominant closer for a long time. And again, I think you need to look no further than the fact that he held the all-time saves record for a while there. And again, do you get into the debate of relief pitchers in the Hall of Fame? Well, I mean, if there are guys that the seal has been broken on that, right? And if you were a guy that like Lee Smith who held that record for a while, then you deserve to be in there, I think, in my opinion. And again, I don't consider myself to be a Hall of Fame purist. I'm not somebody that gets all bent out of shape about who gets elected and who doesn't. And in my mind, if these guys played in the era where I was, in that age, then I think they should get in. I mean, I shouldn't say that. It's not like everybody who played in the '80s should be in the Hall of Fame, but I mean, you talk about guys who lost something because of the strike. Well, what about Dale Murphy, who finishes with what, 493 career home runs, or 498, something like that, was it? I mean, if
he missed it by just a little bit, and it's funny because it was the same argument.
The same thing.
Yeah, I was about to bring that up because I know Brian Kenny always brings it up. It says, if it wasn't for maybe a work stoppage here or there, I mean, what was it? Because McGriff missed it by like 7 home runs or something.
I think he's at 393.
But just for the idea of the speculation, though, it is kind of amazing that with today's metrics, and the 1980s are not that far back, that you can't find, good accumulative data for certain players to be able to build out these metrics. Because actually, I do kind of feel that there should be a few more 1980s players. I mean, obviously, some of these guys weren't obviously on the today's game ballot, but the idea of Keith Hernandez, because he was such a great defensive player and was a very good offensive player, not a traditional offensive, set player like him. You go back to the Royals, Dan Quisenberry put up a very good career. I mean, it wasn't as long as a guy like Hoffman's or a guy like Smith's, who played for, a significant portion of the time. He had, great numbers. And even, not just because Baines got in now, but you can honestly look at a guy like Dale Murphy. Yeah, after his age 30 season, his numbers, he really became an older player. But I feel like as if we're getting to this point nowadays with the game that there's this renewed appreciation for some of the guys who aren't necessarily getting enough credit that were stars, though, in the 1980s.
I hope so. I mean, Murph was a hell of a player. I mean, and again, his fall came earlier than some other guys, but boy, I mean, he won back-to-back MVP awards and was one of the best players in the game for a 4 or 5 year span. And I mean, I remember, when I was younger, hearing people talk about the Hall of Fame and saying, were you one of the best players at your position for an extended period of time? And that has always stuck in my head as sort of one of the measuring sticks. And again, I just think people, I don't, my personal opinion, and I could be completely wrong, but people just take it way, way too seriously. I mean,
they do.
I don't get it. Like if you're that upset that Harold Baines is in the Hall of Fame, then don't go. But I mean, it's amazing to me. And again, I don't want to, keep talking about Baines. I think there are a lot of other guys that, I agree with you. I think Fred McGriff should be in. I think Dale Murphy should be in. Lou Whitaker absolutely deserves to be in.
Lou definitely deserves to.
What's happened to him is criminal. I mean, when you look at his numbers, compared to other guys at his position, he was a fantastic player for an extended period of time.
Yeah, and it's just unfortunate. I mean, he just didn't have those flashy seasons like a guy like Joe Morgan did, which is, again, I mean, that's just tough company because Morgan was just an absolute freak at how great he was for a position that, I mean, let's be realistic. I mean, you look at second basemen from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a lot of them are just slap hitters.
Right.
And, with Whitaker, I mean, he was this good at essentially everything, every single asset to it.
Yeah, and that almost is to his detriment. had he been a worse fielder, but hit 5 more home runs a season, maybe he's
Yeah, because I mean, I always kind of likened him to what was always said about a guy like Barry Larkin. Larkin wasn't the greatest shortstop, but he was good at everything.
Yeah.
And that was his greatest strength, was the fact that, there were seasons he had power, but he was also a good complete hitter, good speed, not the greatest defensive shortstop, but he was sound all around.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great comparison. And I think, boy, I tell you Tram and Whitaker are essentially interchangeable.
Right.
I mean, their numbers are very similar. They obviously played together for all those years. They played in the same team. And for Tram to get in and for Whitaker to just not get a sniff is really criminal. It's awful.
Jonathan, I'd like to thank you for joining me. Again, you can get his new book, Phinally, The Phillies, the Royals, and the 1980 baseball season that almost wasn't, through McFarland Books. You can go to their website and use their holiday code, Holiday18, to get 25% off the order. That's good through December 31st. Of course, I'll leave the info on the screen for you guys to figure that one out. Again, good luck with the book. Congratulations on the book, and hopefully it sells a ton, because I thought it was a great read.
Well, I appreciate it, Seth. Thanks so much for having me, and I hope that it sells a ton, because there's somebody in town that's selling a Fiero, and I need to sell a lot of books so I can buy that Fiero. That's my goal.
No better way to congratulate yourself with a great book by getting yourself the poor man's Porsche.
Exactly.